The Tower of London, rising against the skyline of London, is one of England's most iconic landmarks. Yet beyond its majestic walls lies a history steeped in blood, a place where kings once ruled, prisoners begged for mercy, and executioners sharpened their blades. Built to intimidate and to protect, the tower evolved over the centuries into a symbol of fear, a place where those who entered often faced a grim fate. Its walls have witnessed betrayal, endured torture, and echoed with the agony of countless condemned souls. This is no ordinary historical monument. It is a fortress of death. The Tower of London was built in 1078 by William the Conqueror, a stronghold meant to project the power of the Norman monarchy. But it soon became more than a military fortification. By the end of the 12th century, it served as a royal prison, reserved for the enemies of the crown. In 1078, William the Conqueror ordered the construction of a stone fortress on the banks of the Thames. The White Tower, massive and merciless, was designed to dominate, a relentless beacon of Norman power. For the people of London, its silhouette was not a sign of protection, but of oppression. What began as a military stronghold evolved into a complex structure, a royal palace, an armory, and eventually, a prison. The tower transformed from a shield into a cage. Over the centuries, the Tower of London became a place to imprison the enemies of the crown. Not only criminals, but nobles, clergy, and even royal family members found themselves behind its cold walls. Many never saw the light of day again. The tower earned a reputation that preceded it. Its name alone was enough to instill fear. The threat of imprisonment within its walls was often more powerful than any verdict. For those who entered the tower seldom returned. It became a place of silence and shadow, a labyrinth of stone corridors where whispered confessions, cries of despair, and the chilling stillness of the end all converged. What was once meant as a symbol of authority became an icon of dread, a fortress of fear. To be sent to the tower was not merely a sentence. It was a descent into silence, isolation, and uncertainty. The Tower of London, with its thick stone walls and iron gates, became a final destination for many who dared to defy the crown. Its prisoners ranged from fallen nobles to political rebels, from queens to conspirators. Some had spoken out of turn. Others were caught in the crossfire of power struggles. All shared the same fate, a slow unraveling behind the tower's impenetrable facade. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was imprisoned here before her execution. Accused of adultery and treason, she waited in the Queen's house, a prison cloaked in dignity, yet no less cruel in its promise of death. Her grace under pressure became legendary. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was only 16 when she was confined within the tower's walls. A pawn in a political game she never chose to play, Jane faced her fate with quiet strength and sorrowful acceptance. Others, like Guy Fawkes, were dragged in chains through Traitor's Gate. Suspected of plotting against the state, he endured torture, interrogation, and ultimately a brutal sentence, a journey from rebellion to ruin. Inside the tower, time stretched endlessly. Prisoners wrote final letters, clung to fading hopes of pardon, or prepared for the inevitable. Some prayed for mercy, others welcomed death. Few escaped its grasp. Fewer still were spared. For most, the tower's embrace was cold, final, and absolute, a place where identity faded and fate was sealed. In the shadow of the tower, sentences were carried out with chilling precision. Execution was not merely an end, it was a spectacle, a demonstration of power, a warning to the masses, and an agonizing ordeal for the condemned. The most common method within the tower's walls was beheading. On the scaffold, men and women knelt, their heads resting on a wooden block, awaiting the sharp steel of the axe. One clean strike promised a swift death, but when the executioner faltered, it became a bloody, drawn-out horror. Anne Boleyn, as queen, was granted the rare dignity of a French swordsman. Others, like Margaret Pole, suffered a tragic and clumsy end at the hands of an inexperienced executioner who needed multiple blows to complete the act. For those charged with high treason, an even darker fate awaited: hanging, drawing, and quartering. This method was deliberately slow, designed to break both body and spirit. The condemned was first hanged, not to death, but near it. While still alive, they were cut down, their abdomen opened, and their entrails removed and burned before their very eyes. Finally, the body was quartered, its limbs sent to distant corners of the kingdom as a brutal warning. Guy Fawkes, the infamous conspirator behind the gunpowder plot, was sentenced to this fate. Yet in a final act of defiance, he leapt from the scaffold, breaking his neck and sparing himself the full horror that awaited. Execution was never just about justice. It was ritual, steeped in blood, fear, and symbolism. And the Tower was its altar. Not every death in the Tower of London came by the sword. Many perished slowly, broken by pain, fear, and the relentless cruelty of torture. Behind closed doors, far from public view, the human will was tested in unimaginable ways. The Tower held a grim arsenal of torture devices, each designed with a single purpose: to break resistance. One of the most feared was the Scavenger's Daughter, a metal frame that compressed the prisoner's body into an unnatural position. Knees forced against the chest, head bowed, ribs cracking under pressure. It was a slow suffocation, both physical and mental. Even more infamous was the rack, a deceptively simple device that stretched limbs to their limits. Each turn of the wheel wrenched joints apart, tore muscles, and shattered bones. Under such agony, many confessed, whether guilty or not. Truth became irrelevant beneath the weight of unbearable suffering. Thumb screws, iron shackles, and manacles, smaller tools but equally ruthless. Torture was not an accident. It was policy, a means of spreading fear, extracting confessions, or simply asserting power. One of its most well-known victims was Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest who refused to renounce his faith. Stretched on the rack until his body nearly gave way, he never betrayed his beliefs. His endurance turned him into a martyr, his pain a lasting symbol of human defiance. In the Tower, torture meant more than just pain. It was a weapon, a message, an echo of a time when mercy was weakness and silence could be deadly. In the shadow of the scaffold stood a man who preferred to remain nameless. The executioner, keeper of the blade, enforcer of judgment, and embodiment of death. His task was clear, but his existence complex. He was both necessary and reviled. Executioners were not monsters, nor were they heroes. Their work was dirty, precise, and fraught with risk. One mistake, a trembling hand or a dull blade, could turn a swift death into a gruesome ordeal. An executioner had to be skilled, steady, and merciless. A clean strike was the only mercy he could offer the condemned. Yet there was little honor in the role. Executioners were shunned, feared, and sometimes cursed. Their faces remained hidden behind masks, not from shame, but for protection. To the public, they were the hand of the king. To the bereaved, they were the weapon of injustice. Some executions took place in public squares, watched by thousands. Others, especially those of the highborn, were conducted in silence within Tower Green. There, in the secluded garden, the executioner took the heads of queens, princesses, and nobles with the same restless precision. But even the executioner was not infallible. When he failed, he became a figure of hatred. Every botched blow was a reminder of the inhumanity of his role. His axes, swords, and ropes were meticulously maintained, not with pride, but with grim necessity. The executioner was no judge. He did not decide. He merely delivered. Yet in his hands lay the final experience of the condemned: pain, mercy, or something far more terrifying in between. Some deaths are forgotten, others unforgettable. In the long and bloody history of the Tower of London, there were moments when death was not merely a punishment, but a symbol. These executions, cloaked in tragedy and power, would echo through the centuries. Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII, was once the woman who drove a king to revolution. Her wit and intelligence made her queen, but her failure to produce a male heir sealed her fate. In May 1536, she was charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Her trial was a sham, her guilt predetermined, yet she stood upon the scaffold with uncommon calm. In a rare gesture of mercy, she was granted a French swordsman instead of the axe. One swift stroke, and the life of a queen ended in silence. Lady Jane Grey, just 16 years old, was crowned queen in a desperate bid for power. Her reign lasted only 9 days. When Bloody Mary reclaimed her rightful place on the throne, Jane became a pawn in a game she never chose. In February 1554, she was led to Tower Green. Young, devout, and with a dignity far beyond her years, she died a martyr to an ambition that was never her own. Sir Thomas More, statesman and scholar, chose conscience over obedience. When Henry VIII declared himself head of the Church of England, More refused to acknowledge it. His silence was deemed treason. In July 1535, he climbed the scaffold with conviction in his voice and peace in his heart. His execution made him a symbol of unwavering moral strength. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was old and innocent, but her bloodline, her family ties, and her loyalty to the Catholic faith made her dangerous. In 1541, she was sentenced without a fair trial. When she refused to lay her head upon the block, the inexperienced executioner struck blindly. It took multiple blows. Her death was not justice. It was butchery. These lives, ended within the tower's stone embrace, were more than historical footnotes. They were moments where power clashed with principle, honor with politics, faith with fear. And in death, they found what life denied them: eternal remembrance. Behind the imposing walls of the Tower of London, many prisoners began an invisible battle. No swords, no scaffolds, only silence, cold, and the slow erosion of hope. For those who didn't leave through the executioner's hand, another fate awaited: life behind the bars. The cells ranged from bare stone holes to royal chambers, depending on rank and status. But even comfort was a lie. No luxury could mask the truth. That one's freedom was gone, surrendered to the whims of power. Each day was a repetition of waiting for news, for questioning, for mercy, or for death. The walls listened to prayers and screams, to whispers and despair. Some prisoners wrote letters, pleas to family or the king. Others etched their names, poems, or last words into the stone, permanent scars on the tower's heart. Some endured through faith or defiance. Others slowly broke beneath the weight of uncertainty. Sir Walter Raleigh, locked for years in the Bloody Tower, spent his days writing and studying. His words, carved in captivity, outlived the man who wrote them. And yet, there were also stories of escape, of courage and cunning, attempts that sometimes failed, sometimes succeeded, but always spoke to the unbreakable human spirit. Life in the tower was not just punishment of the body, it was torment of the mind, a daily reminder that freedom had become a memory, and in that darkness, some found strength, while others found their end. When the sun sets and the shadows stretch long across the grounds, the Tower of London takes on another face. Its cold stone no longer merely breathes history, but something deeper, something unseen. For though the blood has long since dried from the scaffold, the voices of the dead have never truly gone silent. Over the centuries, guards, visitors, and historians have reported unexplained phenomena. Whispers in empty halls, icy gusts in sealed chambers, and the sudden, unmistakable feeling of being watched. The most famous ghost is that of Anne Boleyn. Her headless spirit is said to still wander the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her remains were laid to rest. Some claim to have seen her figure, elegant, yet haunting, her hands cradling an invisible head. In the Bloody Tower, The ghosts of the princes in the tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, are said to linger. Children's laughter, soft footsteps, and, at times, the sound of weeping, echoes of an ancient mystery that remains unsolved. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, is believed to scream through the gardens of Tower Green, her spirit condemned to relive her brutal death over and over again. And on misty mornings, whispers tell of a white figure gliding across the walls, always just out of reach of the light. Not all tales are ancient. Even in the 20th century, soldiers and visitors have reported strange occurrences, doors opening on their own, cold hands brushing past from nowhere, lights flickering without cause. The Tower of London is not merely a place of stone in history. It is a living archive of sorrow, vengeance, and restless souls, where the past refuses to die, and the dead may be closer than we think. For centuries, death at the Tower of London was a public spectacle, a cruel ritual that drew crowds as much as it inspired fear. Executions were not only punishment, but performance. Every fallen head, every silent scream, was meant to reaffirm the authority of the crown. But the world changed, and with it, the understanding of justice. By the 19th century, public opinion began to shift. What was once seen as necessary and fearsome began to be viewed as barbaric. People questioned the morality of public executions. The brutality, the blood, the suffering, the children watching from the front row became unbearable for a society that longed to appear more humane. In 1868, public executions were officially abolished in England. The scaffolds vanished from the streets. Death sentences would now be carried out behind closed doors, quietly, without cheering crowds. The Tower of London, once the stage for hundreds of executions, grew still, and yet death returned one final time. During World War II, in 1941, the German spy Joseph Jacobs was executed within the tower's walls. He was shot by firing squad, the last person to lose his life within the fortress. After that, the executioner's blade fell silent forever. Today, visitors stand in the shadow of Tower Green, where the axe once rose. The echoes remain, but the weapons are buried. What endures is a history that speaks, not in screams, but in whispers of warning, remembrance, and regret. The Tower of London stands not merely as a structure of stone and steel, but as a witness, a silent, centuries-old observer of power and abuse, of rise and ruin, of justice and raw injustice. Its walls have echoed with royal celebrations and wept with the cries of the condemned. Every stone bears the weight of stories, of kings who secured their thrones through blood, of queens who lost their heads to politics, of rebels, martyrs, and nameless souls who never made the history books, but forever dwell in its shadow. The tower is not a museum of the past. It is living memory. It reminds us of the price of power, of the cruelty committed in the name of order, and of the resilience of those who endured until the end. Today, visitors walk its corridors, look down upon Tower Green, and gaze upward at the bloody tower. They listen to guides, read plaques, but the true story lies in the silence between the stones, in the chill of a cell's draft, in the footsteps that never returned home. The Tower of London is no monument of glory. It is a cautionary tale, a place where history and pain meet, and where the echoes of the past still whisper to those willing to hear. September 21st, 1327. Behind the cold, silent walls of Berkeley Castle, a king waits in chains. Once crowned by God and crowned in gold, Edward II now lies broken, his body bruised, his dignity stripped. In the dead of night, two men enter his cell. They carry no sword, no poison. Instead, they bring a horn and a red-hot iron. What follows is not simply an execution. It is a performance of symbolic cruelty, a death crafted to leave no wound but speak volumes. His screams are muffled, his body left intact, his soul torn from him by fire and silence. By morning, England has no king, only a corpse, contorted in agony, and a story that will haunt history. But was it truth, or legend. Edward of Caernarfon was born on April 25, 1284, into the shadow of greatness. The youngest surviving son of Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, heir to a brutal legacy of conquest and kingship. But from his earliest days, it was clear that this prince would not mirror the father who bore his name. Where Edward I was iron-willed, martial, and feared, his son was gentle, curious, and drawn to the pleasures of life far from the battlefield. He preferred swimming to swordplay, crafts to crusades. He mingled with laborers, worked beside peasants, and delighted in the company of those beneath his station. To the king, this was not innocence, it was weakness. Disgusted by his son's softness, Edward grew increasingly cruel. In one infamous outburst, he tore fistfuls of the boy's hair from his scalp. Furious that the prince dared ask a royal title for a favorite companion, the young Gascon noble Piers Gaveston. Between them stretched a chasm of expectation and disappointment. One built empires with blood and steel. The other would one day lose one with silence and love. The seeds of a tragedy were sown not in betrayal, but in difference. He was everything the young Edward was not: bold, witty, magnetic. Piers Gaveston, a knight of modest Gascon origins, entered the prince's household as a companion. But what began as friendship quickly deepened into something far more dangerous. Chroniclers would later call it a bond beyond all measure, a covenant of indissoluble love. Whether chivalric ideal or forbidden passion, their intimacy soon consumed the English court. When Edward I exiled Gaveston, hoping to sever the tie, the future king swore to bring him back, and did so at the first breath of freedom. Upon ascending the throne in 1307, Edward II recalled Gaveston immediately, granting him the title of Earl of Cornwall, a dignity traditionally reserved for royal blood. Worse still, Gaveston was lavished with gifts, influence, and a role in the coronation itself, carrying St. Edward's crown in open defiance of noble protocol. The court was scandalized. The Queen, Isabella of France, was humiliated. Her jewels, gifted by Edward, were seen in Gaveston's possession. The nobility seethed, seeing not a king, but a puppet entangled in desire. By 1312, their fury turned lethal. Gaveston was seized by rebellious lords, mocked and butchered beside a quiet road. A lover, perhaps. A threat, certainly. A warning, undeniably. She was just 12 years old when she arrived in England, a princess of France, daughter of the formidable King Philip IV, offered in marriage to secure peace between rival crowns. Isabella of France was young, but she understood her role, to become Queen of England, consort to Edward II, and mother to his heirs. But from the moment of her wedding in 1308, it was clear that she had entered not a marriage, but a triangle. Edward lavished his attention not on his bride, but on Piers Gaveston. During the coronation festivities, Isabella was ignored while her husband clung to his favorite. Even the jewels meant for her wedding gift were rumored to have been passed to Gaveston, a private insult made painfully public. The court whispered. Foreign envoys raised eyebrows. And Isabella, a child queen in a strange land, swallowed the first taste of humiliation that would come to define her early reign. In her husband's eyes, she was a political obligation. In her own, she was a queen without power, without dignity, and increasingly without place. The seeds of resentment took root early, and as Edward's obsessions deepened, so too did Isabella's resolve. A humiliated queen, history would learn, is never just a victim. By 1312, the patience of England's nobility had worn thin. Piers Gaveston, mocking, lavish, and dangerously close to the king, had become more than an insult. He was a threat to the very structure of aristocratic power. His influence corrupted court appointments, diverted royal favors, and emboldened a king who refused to see the storm gathering around him. The barons acted. Led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, they seized Gaveston while Edward was away. There was no trial, no appeal to justice. The verdict had already been written, in blood. On a desolate stretch of road near Warwick, Gaveston was mocked, stripped of his titles, and summarily executed. Stabbed and then beheaded, his body was left exposed as a message to the king. The crown would not protect favorites. Edward II was shattered. Upon hearing the news, he reportedly collapsed in grief, refusing food and speech. The man he had loved, whatever the nature of that love, was gone, murdered by men he could not punish. But Edward would not forget, nor would he forgive. In Gaveston's death, the king's bitterness hardened into resolve. The scars left by the blade that killed his favorite would not heal. They would fester and return with vengeance. In 1314, Edward II marched north with an army to crush the defiance of Robert the Bruce and reclaim English dominance over Scotland. What followed was not victory, but humiliation. At the Battle of Bannockburn, near Stirling, the English were routed, overwhelmed by a smaller, more determined Scottish force. Knights drowned in marshes, banners fell. The king himself fled the field, barely escaping with his life. The defeat shattered the illusion of strength. Territories won by his father were lost in a single day. Edward's reputation, already weakened by scandal, now reeked of failure. The nobility questioned his judgment. The commons suffered the consequences. Scottish raids devastated the north. Confidence in royal leadership crumbled. Worse still was the state of the royal finances. The treasury, once filled by Edward I's conquests, was now bled dry by favoritism, court excess, and poor governance. Taxation rose, resentment deepened. And yet, the king learned nothing. Rather than restore order, Edward repeated his gravest mistake. He found another favorite. Hugh Despenser the Younger emerged to fill the void left by Gaveston, and soon eclipsed even his predecessor's influence. The battlefield had exposed Edward's weakness, but the court would show how dangerous that weakness could become. Edward II had lost one favorite in blood. He would not lose the next so easily. In 1316, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a sharp-minded noble with royal connections and insatiable ambition, began his quiet ascent. Through calculated loyalty and the strategic marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, he embedded himself at the heart of power. By 1318, he was royal chamberlain. By 1320, he was the kingdom's shadow ruler. What followed was not governance but exploitation. Hugh used his closeness to the king to seize lands, manipulate lawsuits, and strip wealth from widows and rivals. Even his own family became targets of his greed. The nobility, still raw from the scars of Gaveston, watched in horror as the cycle repeated. Only this time it was worse. The Despensers, father and son, did not flatter power. They wielded it. With Edward as their shield, they built a regime of coercion, corruption, and vengeance. Nobles were dispossessed. Justice bent. Fear spread like plague. By 1322, the barons had risen in rebellion. Their defeat at Boroughbridge brought temporary peace, but at a terrible price. Edward had chosen Despenser over his kingdom, and in doing so, he ensured that his own downfall would be as complete and as brutal as his favorite's rise. Once a humiliated queen, Isabella of France now became something far more dangerous, a woman with a cause. In 1325, she was sent to her native France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, but once across the Channel she refused to return. Her message was clear: not while the Despensers still ruled her husband and England. In exile, Isabella shed the veil of submission. No longer merely a royal consort, she forged a new identity as a political operator and avenger. At her side stood Roger Mortimer, a baron who had once escaped from the Tower of London. Their alliance, both strategic and intimate, became the engine of rebellion. From the courts of France and the Low Countries, they gathered support. Exiled nobles, mercenaries, and foreign sympathizers pledged loyalty. Letters passed in secret. Gold changed hands. Ships were armed. In public, Isabella claimed she fought for her son, the young Edward III. In truth, she fought for her throne and her vengeance. When they landed in England in September 1326, it was with a small army, but a tidal wave of support. Nobles defected. Towns surrendered. The Queen had returned, not as consort, but as conqueror. The hunted had become the hunter. The invasion was swift, but its impact was thunderous. In September 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed on English soil with only a modest force, but the kingdom welcomed them as liberators. Years of dispenser tyranny had broken the nobility's loyalty and the people's patience. As cities opened their gates and barons raised their banners, Edward II and the dispensers fled westward, dragging the royal treasury behind them. But flight could not save them. On October 27th, Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured at Bristol, his execution immediate and savage. He was hanged in full armor, then beheaded and quartered, his remains scattered as a warning. For Hugh the Younger, worse awaited. Captured with the king near Neath, he was dragged to Hereford and subjected to one of the most grotesque public executions in English history, castrated, disemboweled alive, then beheaded and quartered. His screams, it is said, echoed through the crowd like a curse. Edward, powerless and alone, was brought to Kenilworth. There, under pressure from Parliament and his enemies, he abdicated on January 25, 1327, in favor of his 14-year-old son. The king who had ruled by favoritism now had no favorites left, only enemies, and none willing to save him. After his forced abdication, Edward II was no longer a king, he was a liability. Stripped of his crown, his dignity, and his defenders, he was moved under heavy guard to Berkeley Castle. There, behind thick stone walls and locked iron doors, began a slow descent, not into death, but into something crueler, erasure. At first, his imprisonment was measured. He was allowed servants, modest comfort, and letters. But the presence of Hugh Despenser's memory still clung to him, and to his captors. That was intolerable. As rumors of rescue plots swirled, his conditions worsened. He was kept in squalor, exposed to the cold, and deprived of human contact. His captors, Sir John Maltravers and Sir Thomas Gurney, are said to have subjected him to humiliation, forcing him to ride without trousers, allowing vermin to infest his bedding, and denying him even basic cleanliness. His royal name meant nothing now. He was not a guest. He was a ghost in waiting. The man once draped in ermine and crowned in gold now lived in silence, his mind unraveling. There would be no trial, no final audience, only whispers in corridors, and a waiting death. For a king who once ruled by desire, his prison was designed to destroy his very sense of self. The night of September 21st, 1327, is etched into legend, but shrouded in silence. In the deepest hours, two men allegedly entered Edward II's cell at Berkeley Castle. They carried no blade, no poison. What they brought was something darker, a horn tube and a red-hot iron. According to later chronicles, they pinned the former king beneath pillows, muffled his screams, and inserted the instrument of torture into his body, burning him from within, leaving no visible wounds. It was a murder cloaked in symbolism, meant to punish not just the man, but the sin his enemies believed he embodied. But did it happen? No contemporary record describes the method. The gruesome tale appears only decades later, in the Chronicle of Geoffrey le Baker, a text written under a king eager to demonize his father's killers. To some historians, the tale reeks of political theater, not truth. Other possibilities abound: smothering, starvation, or even simple neglect. Some go further still, suggesting Edward escaped, replaced by a corpse, and lived out his days as a hermit abroad. What we know is that a body was buried, a tomb raised, and a legend born. Whether fact or fabrication, the death of Edward II remains one of history's most haunting riddles. In 1330, 3 years after Edward II's supposed death, a letter arrived at the court of his son, Edward III. It came from an Italian priest named Manuel Fieschi, and contained an astonishing claim. Edward II had not been murdered at Berkeley Castle. He had escaped. According to the Fieschi letter, a servant had died in his place. The former king fled through Ireland and France, eventually settling in Italy, living humbly as a hermit. The letter even described a secret meeting between father and son years later, unrecorded, unproven, but tantalizing. Historians remain divided. Some dismiss it as political fiction, crafted to destabilize Mortimer's regime or ease Edward III's guilt. Others point to circumstantial evidence, sightings of a Welshman at European courts, and inconsistencies in the funeral records. What the Fieschi letter offered was not just a theory, it was hope, legend, and political intrigue rolled into one. If true, it would rewrite a king's death. If false, it only deepened the shadow that already hung over that fateful night at Berkeley. On December 20th, 1327, a royal funeral was held at Gloucester Abbey. The body, whoever it truly belonged to, was embalmed, adorned, and entombed beneath an ornate alabaster effigy. Edward II, dead or vanished, had been transformed into memory. The tomb was magnificent. It bore the face of a serene king, unmarred by torture, untouched by scandal. No hint of humiliation or horror, only dignity carved in stone. It became a place of pilgrimage, a royal monument wrapped in silence. Politically, the burial served a purpose. It closed the book on a dangerous question. With Edward declared dead, Isabella and Mortimer could rule without the threat of a living king, but their grip would not last. In 1330, Edward III seized power, executed Mortimer, and imprisoned his mother, avenging the father whose end remained a national wound. The tomb still stands today, visited by those drawn to the tragic tale. Beneath its quiet surface lies not only a body, but a question. Was this the resting place of a murdered monarch, or a decoy for a king who slipped away? Stone endures. Stories survive. And Edward II, in death as in life, remains both enigma and echo. Centuries after his death, Edward II found a second life, not in history books, but on the stage. In the late 16th century, playwright Christopher Marlowe transformed the fallen king into a tragic figure. His Edward II was not merely a monarch undone by politics, but a man destroyed by passion, betrayal, and desire. Marlowe's version, though veiled in poetic ambiguity, left little doubt. Edward's downfall was inseparable from his love for his favorites. Audiences watched a king alienated by his court, tormented by power, and undone by the very emotions that made him human. In productions that followed, the infamous red-hot poker scene was often staged. Gruesome, theatrical, unforgettable. Modern historians have continued to wrestle with Edward's image. Was he a tyrant or a victim? A negligent ruler or a man crushed by circumstance? The debate has shifted from condemnation to complexity. In time, Edward became more than a failed king. He became a symbol, a figure onto whom generations projected their fears, prejudices, and evolving understanding of love, power, and legitimacy. His legacy was shaped not only by chroniclers, but by artists, scholars, and an audience eager to find meaning in his suffering. Edward II's fall was more than a political collapse. It was a rupture in the very fabric of medieval kingship. In 1327, for the first time in English history, a crowned monarch was formally deposed. The divine right of kings, once unassailable, had been challenged not by foreign invaders, but by his own wife, nobles, and parliament. That act would echo across centuries, resurfacing in the downfalls of Richard II, Charles I, and beyond. But Edward's legacy reaches further still, entangled with the question of identity. His close, possibly romantic relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer became fuel for scandal in his lifetime, and for centuries, the language of his downfall was steeped in accusations of unnatural love and moral failure. His sexuality, real or perceived, became inseparable from his political demise. This intertwining of queerness and catastrophe became a recurring narrative in European history. Edward II's fate helped shape a cultural pattern. That deviation from sexual norms in the halls of power leads inevitably to ruin. Yet with time, perspectives shift. Today, Edward is revisited not as a caricature of failure, but as a human figure, tragic, complex, and ahead of his time. His legacy is not just about what he lost, but what his story continues to reveal. A crown glitters brightest on a child's head, but behind the gold lies silence. For centuries, royal daughters were currency, traded across empires, veiled in silk and wed to strangers. Too young to choose, too valuable to ignore, they became pawns in dynastic games. Some obeyed, some resisted, a few rewrote history. These are not fairy tales, but chronicles of survival, where girlhood ended at the altar. From France to the Mongol steppe, Denmark to Constantinople, they wore crowns like armor. Their names are whispered in footnotes, their pain buried beneath titles. But the truth remains, every crown has a cost. She was 15, a princess of Spain, raised among crusades and cathedrals. Her name, Catherine of Aragon. Her destiny, England. Her mission, to marry the crown prince, Arthur Tudor. Arthur was also 15, frail, pale, and groomed as heir to a shaky dynasty. Their marriage was no love story. It was a pact, an alliance between two kingdoms, sealed by two children who could barely sign their names. The wedding took place in 1501. A golden gown, Spanish lace, thousands watching. But behind the pageantry lay something colder, uncertainty, fear, and ignorance. After the celebration, they were sent to Ludlow Castle, alone. No parents, no advisors, only duty and expectation. Within months, they fell ill. Fever, blood, dread. Arthur died. Catherine survived. A widow at 16, with no husband, no status, no future. But her story didn't end there. She stayed in England. She claimed the marriage had never been consummated, that in the eyes of God, she was still untouched. She waited, she prayed, and in time, she married Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII. For years, they were happy, until the throne demanded an heir, and Catherine could not deliver. The night in Ludlow, that one marriage, that one unanswered question, returned like a ghost. Had she told the truth? Had she lied? What followed wasn't just a divorce, it was a rupture. England broke from Rome, Europe split apart, and it all began with two teenagers, a wedding in gold, and a question never truly resolved. Catherine became a queen, but the price was her youth, her dignity, and in the end, her crown. She was 6 days old when her father died. With his final breath, Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland. A crown heavier than her cradle, inherited before her first smile. At 5, she was sent to France, not for safety, but for strategy. Raised at court, draped in silk, trained to charm. Her fate was already sealed, to marry the French heir, Francis. He was a year younger, delicate, shy, and always ill. Together, they were royal children shaped into tools for empires. At 15, Mary became a bride. The wedding was a spectacle at Notre Dame. White satin, silver embroidery, she looked like an angel. But this was no fairy tale. Francis recoiled from crowds, his health declining. Mary, taller and sharper, navigated court life with poise. She brought more than grace, she brought acclaim. Through Tudor blood, she was a threat to England's throne. In 1559, a freak accident killed France's king, a shattered lance to the eye. Suddenly, Francis and Mary were king and queen, Scotland, France, and maybe England, all in the hands of teenagers. But power built on sickness rarely lasts. 17 months later, Francis was dead. An ear infection, a brain abscess. History is unsure. Mary was 17, a double widow, wearing 2 crowns and no protection. The French court turned cold. Catherine de' Medici, Francis's mother, seized power. Mary, now a foreign inconvenience, was cast out. She returned to Scotland, a land she barely knew, to rule a kingdom torn by religion and greed. Her future would spiral into scandal, betrayal, and eventually the axe. But it began here. A child bride, a sickly boy king, and a marriage dressed in diamonds, but forged in silence. She was crowned before she could crawl, but her fall would echo for centuries. She was 6 years old, a princess of France, daughter of King Charles VI, born into a court of opulence, but haunted by madness and war. Her name, Isabella of Valois. Her fate, to stop the 100 Years' War with her tiny hands. In 1396, peace was fragile. Treaties cracked like old glass. England and France needed something symbolic, something binding. So they offered a child. Her groom, King Richard II of England. He was 29, a widower, desperate for legitimacy. His throne wobbled beneath him, enemies circling. He needed a French alliance. What he got was a child bride. The marriage caused outrage. Even in an age where royal unions ignored love, a 6-year-old girl marrying a grown man shocked the court. Yet the wedding went ahead. In Calais, little Isabella was dressed in white and gold, a peace offering wrapped in brocade. Chroniclers say Richard tried to comfort her, promising, "You are my wife now, and I will be good to you." He vowed not to touch her until she was older, a gallant promise, but one laced with discomfort. He brought her to England, gave her dolls, jewels, governesses. But it wasn't love, it was theater. A child queen for a fractured kingdom. For a moment, it worked. The people adored the innocent French princess, but it didn't last. 2 years later, Richard left for Ireland. While he was gone, Henry Bolingbroke returned with an army. The crown fell. Richard was imprisoned and likely murdered. Isabella was 8, no longer a queen, just a political pawn. France demanded her return. England resisted. When she finally crossed the Channel, it was without status, without power. She would marry again, by choice this time. But she died at 19, barely older than a child, remembered not as a queen, but as the price of peace. She was 12, small, solemn, born into a kingdom torn by war. Her name, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of royalty through John of Gaunt. Her future was already chosen. She would not be a child. She would be a vessel for legacy, for power, for the Tudor name. Her husband was Edmund Tudor in his mid-20s, ambitious, politically shrewd, and determined to plant a claim to the throne. Their marriage was not a union, it was a strategy. And Margaret, barely out of childhood, was given no say. At 13, she was pregnant. Her body, still delicate, was forced to carry the weight of England's future. The pregnancy was brutal. Some said she screamed through the night. Others wrote she could hardly walk again. On January 28, 1457, in the cold stone walls of Pembroke Castle, she gave birth to a son, Henry Tudor, her only child. But survival came at a cost. The birth left her physically broken. She would never have another child. A girl asked to do a woman's work had paid the price in blood and bone. Before Henry was born, Edmund died, likely of plague, imprisoned in Wales. Margaret became a widow at 13, a mother and alone, surrounded by men who saw her as a pawn, but underestimated her entirely. She never remarried for love, never bore another heir. Instead, she built alliances, plotted in silence, and kept her son's claim alive through decades of danger. When the crown finally fell to Henry at Bosworth in 1485, it was Margaret's victory too. She had forged a king from her pain. She signed her letters, Margaret R., the king's mother. But before the power came the blood. Before the dynasty, a child, and before the crown, a girl who nearly died to make it. She was 14, a Habsburg archduchess raised on minuets and military discipline, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa. Her name, Marie Antoinette. Her fate, France. Her mission, to marry the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, heir to the Bourbon throne. He was 15, awkward, soft-spoken, more at ease with keys and locks than with conversation. Their marriage was a political bridge between old enemies, Austria and France. But beneath the embroidery and powdered wigs, disaster was already brewing. The moment she crossed the French border, her Austrian identity was stripped away. Her clothes, her language, even her dog, gone. She was remade as the future Queen of France. Their wedding was lavish, but the marriage was brittle. Louis was shy, possibly suffering from a condition that made intimacy difficult. For 7 years, their union remained unconsummated. The court gossiped, pamphlets mocked. Marie, still a teenager, was painted as cold, frivolous, even promiscuous. Versailles was not home, it was theater. Her loneliness became legend. In 1774, the old king died. At 19 and 20, Louis and Marie became king and queen, children on a crumbling throne. Marie turned to distractions, fashion, balls, impossible hairstyles. The people turned against her. Let them eat cake, they claimed she said. She didn't, but the damage was done. As France starved, her image became the face of excess. The revolution rose, the Bastille fell, and the golden cage shattered. In 1793, at 37, she walked to the guillotine. No jewels, no powdered wig, just the shadow of the 14-year-old girl who once crossed the border into a kingdom that would destroy her. Her marriage was meant to unite nations. Instead, it lit the match of revolution. Marie Antoinette came to France as a bride. She left as a warning. She was 18, crowned Queen of Egypt, last in a long line of rulers descended from Ptolemy, Alexander the Great's general. Her name, Cleopatra VII. Her kingdom, fragile. Her fate, shared. For her father had decreed she must rule with and marry her younger brother. He was 10. Ptolemy the 13th, a boy king, guided by ruthless advisors who saw Cleopatra not as a sister, but as a threat. The marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about family. It was about dynasty, keeping bloodlines pure and power controlled. But Cleopatra would not be controlled. She refused to share authority, issued decrees in her own name, placed her image alone on coins. She even learned Egyptian, something no ruler of her line had done. That made her dangerous. The palace in Alexandria became a battlefield of whispers. Factions rose. The court turned. In 49 BCE, she was forced to flee. Across the desert, disguised, she gathered troops. A queen in exile, but not defeated. Then came Caesar. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt to mediate the siblings' feud. Cleopatra didn't walk into his court. She had herself smuggled in, rolled inside a rug, and dramatically unwrapped before him. It worked. Charm, intellect, strategy. He was captivated. War followed. Caesar backed Cleopatra. Alexandria burned. And in the chaos, Ptolemy XIII drowned trying to escape, just 13 years old. Cleopatra returned to the throne, alone this time. She would rule with Caesar's son, then later with Mark Antony. Her name became legend, but it began with a brother husband, a power struggle, and a rug that changed history. Cleopatra was not born a goddess. She became one through fire, cunning, and defiance. She was still a girl when her marriage was arranged. Her name, Matilda of Flanders. Her future tied to an ambitious duke known as William the Bastard. He was illegitimate, fierce, and determined to claim not just Normandy, but England. Their union was more than a match. It was a gamble. A noblewoman of impeccable lineage paired with a man born on the wrong side of a royal bed. Many whispered she would never accept him. At first, she didn't. Legend says Matilda rejected William, that he responded not with flowers, but fury, riding to her father's court, dragging her from her horse by her braids. Fact or myth, what followed was real. She married him, on her own terms, and she did not marry lightly. Matilda was no passive duchess. She governed Normandy in William's absence. She signed charters, managed armies, and ran the court. When William sailed to conquer England in 1066, it was Matilda who secured his rear, politically, financially, and with the loyalty of Normandy's elite. While he fought at Hastings, she ruled at home. When news came of William's victory, it wasn't just his triumph, it was hers. She was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey in 1068. The first of her line. A queen forged not by inheritance, but by alliance, strength, and strategy. Their marriage, though marked by fire and ambition, was enduring. Together they founded a dynasty that would shape England for generations. But behind that dynasty stood the girl from Flanders, clever, proud, and never meant to be silent. Matilda married a bastard duke. She crowned a king, and in doing so, became the quiet architect of conquest. In the glittering labyrinth of the Russian court, where brides were bartered and power passed through marriage beds, one woman chose a different path. Her name, Sofia Alexeyevna, daughter of Tsar Alexis, sister to two future czars, a Romanov by birth, but a ruler by will. She never married. In a world where royal daughters were defined by alliances, Sofia defied custom. Intelligent, politically astute, and deeply educated, she refused to be sold into a foreign court or bound to a nobleman. Instead, she reached for something forbidden: power. In 1682, the Russian throne teetered. Her brother Fyodor was dead. Her half-brothers, one sickly, one a child named Peter, left a vacuum. Through a coup backed by the Streltsy Guard, Sofia installed herself as regent. Officially, she ruled in the name of her brothers. In practice, she ruled alone. She sat behind a double throne with Ivan and Peter as puppets. She negotiated treaties, quelled rebellions, and reshaped Russia's foreign policy. But behind her courtly poise, resentment brewed. A woman with power was already a scandal. A woman with power and no husband, a threat. She built her court around loyal women, avoided marriage entirely, and cultivated the image of Russia's guiding hand. But Peter grew older and bolder. At 17, he seized control. The Streltsy turned. Sofia was imprisoned in a convent, her name stripped from state records, her influence erased. She died decades later, uncrowned, unmarried, and unheard. But for 7 years, Russia was ruled by a woman who refused to wed. Not a bride, not a wife. A czarina who wore no crown, but held the reins of an empire. Sofia chose power over partnership, and in doing so, rewrote the rules, if only briefly. She was 12 when the crown was placed on her head. Hedwig of Poland, daughter of Louis the Great of Hungary, descended from kings and saints. But she wasn't born to rule Poland, until politics changed everything. Her elder sister was passed over. A male heir never came, and so the crown fell on Hedwig's small shoulders. A child queen, in a kingdom at a crossroads. In 1385, Poland faced threats on all sides. The answer came from the east, a union with Lithuania. But there was a cost. Hedwig was to marry the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila. He was 26, pagan, foreign, and not the man she loved. She had been betrothed to William of Austria, a boy she knew, perhaps even adored, but love held no weight in the cold calculations of state. Jogaila promised conversion, unity, protection. The Polish lords demanded the match. Hedwig wept. Legend says she tried to break down the castle doors with an axe to escape her fate. But in the end, she relented. For her people. At 13, she married Jogaila, now baptized Władysław. Their union created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest political entities in Europe. It was a diplomatic miracle, born from the sacrifice of a girl. Hedwig ruled not as consort, but as monarch in her own right. She founded schools, protected the poor, and reformed law. Her reign was short, but luminous. She died in childbirth at 25, her only child lost with her. But her memory lived. In 1997, she was canonized as a saint. Hedwig gave her life, her love, her body, for a nation. She was not just a queen, she was a cornerstone. She entered the Forbidden City as a teenage concubine, one among many, unremarkable, silent, selected to serve the emperor's pleasure. Her name, Sixi. Born into a fading Manchu noble family, she had no power, no title, only ambition. She learned quickly. In 1856, she gave birth to a son, the emperor's only heir. That changed everything. From concubine, she became consort Yi. From background figure, she became a mother to a future emperor. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, his son was 5. Sixi, still in her 20s, made her move. She joined forces with the emperor's widow and staged a coup. Ministers were arrested, rivals exiled, and the child emperor was placed under her regency. But Sixi didn't sit on the throne. She ruled from behind a silk screen, literally. In court audiences, she listened, decided, commanded, all while hidden. It was a compromise with tradition, but she was no puppet. For over 4 decades, she controlled the Qing dynasty. Through 2 emperors, rebellions, foreign invasions, and reform crises, she maneuvered with ruthless brilliance. She modernized China's military, built railways, and navigated the twilight of empire with steel and silk gloves. Yet her image remains divided, a scheming despot to some, a savior to others. She never remarried, never left the court. She built her world inside palace walls and controlled the fate of a nation from within them. Cixi began as a girl chosen to serve. She became the woman who ruled an empire, not from a throne, not from a battlefield, but from behind a screen, with power sharper than any sword. 10 stories, 10 girls, each draped in silk, crowned in gold, and handed over like signatures on a treaty. They came from different lands: Poland, France, China, Egypt. They lived in castles, courts, and palaces, but their fate was shared. They were daughters, not yet women, asked to carry nations on their shoulders. Some ruled with fire, others vanished into footnotes, a few became legends, but none escaped the cost. These weren't fairy tales, they were sacrifices. For every crown, a lost childhood. For every alliance, a broken heart. Behind dynasties and empires lie the bodies of girls who never got to choose. Brides who became warriors, queens who lived in silence, empresses who ruled in shadows. History remembers kings who conquered, but we must also remember the girls who were conquered first. By duty, by marriage, by the heavy hand of history. Because power doesn't always look like a sword. Sometimes it looks like a veil.